So yeah, about my project. After looking at the sprite sheet for 5 minutes, somehow I had the absolute idea and intention of making a car game. Something with post-apocalyptic stuff in it, because somehow I saw some sprites in the sprite sheet that really just spoke to me, hey, make something post-apocalyptic. So my first goal was to make a car. If you have an idea for a project, I think it's not a bad way of starting with one key element and then go from there. Oftentimes when you build that, there are already coming ideas together. I didn't want to make a big concept of how exactly the game is going to work out. So I really just started with bashing sprites together. And while doing that, I developed the game design idea in my head. It felt much more organic than planning everything out. Yeah, and while building the first car from those sprites, I really wanted to do something with guns because I'm really a fan of action games and screen shake. That's my thing. The cars needed to have guns, they needed to be fast, V8s, and race around the wasteland desert and yeah, run over stuff and shoot stuff and explosions everywhere. So that was my goal for that project. So then after I finished the car, I started thinking about the car physics, the car controls. Yeah, and after following some tutorials, to be honest, I had something basically working. I made some tire tracks using line 2D and a small script that just spawns points where the tire is. And I also added a little bit of particles. Yeah, you could argue that it's too early to do this kind of polishing, but in the end, I think it's very important to get a feel about what the final thing will be. And for me, that's just part of the process. Without the particle effects, the drifting wouldn't look so cool. Sometimes it's not even that much work getting those things in and running. I then started working on the acceleration, on the speed, and I quickly had the feeling that just adding linear acceleration would be super boring. So I did some research and found a really good Reddit post explaining racing car simulations for games. This post was pure gold. I basically took that approach for my game. And what I got from that was a really very simple gear switching system. If the gear is switched, I could play an animation. It felt much more alive and much more like a real car and not like some sprites floating around. Yeah, and after that, the next absolutely logical step was to add guns to the car. At the moment, they don't really shoot, it's just an animation. But you can already see that it looks much more fun to drive around, to shoot stuff. I also wanted to integrate some funny stories, some funny characters to underline the crazy wasteland that the player is in. So I implemented a very simple dialogue system and wrote some very simple and I tried to be funny dialogues. And yeah, I used the sprites of the sprite sheet to make very simple animated characters to make it even more charismatic. Then I started working on some basic environment for the game. I used some parts of the sprite sheet. I combined them in Sprite to create a road texture. Yeah, so adding this texture to a simple line 2D, never forget to enable repeat, makes for a really cool texture. You can see here it's working all right. It's not perfect, but good start. I noticed that the road really looked boring and it could need some texture to break it up. Yeah, in this case a shader because I couldn't use an outside texture. So I wrote a very simple shader that basically fades out the edges of the road to make it blend in better into the environment. And I also added some noise to just make it a bit more interesting and give it a bit more sandy look. In the next step I added a shader to a ground sprite. In my case I wanted to make it a little sandy, stony texture. So I just combined different noise textures to this shader, and in the end it made blend the road and the surface of the sand really nicely together. It's really valuable to have a little bit of knowledge with shaders in my opinion. So for the next step I wanted to create some mountains to give the maps some interesting layouts and also areas where the player can't go, to confine his area of motion and of movement to the map. And to do that, I used a plugin called Smart Shape 2D. It's very nice. If you don't know it, it's really worth your time checking out if you need such elements. It can also save you a lot of time. Basically what it does is it lets you draw a polygon and you can apply different textures to the edges, to the outsides, to the fill. Then you can configure those edges. In the current version, it even supports materials, so you can add shaders to the edges. It's really nice. So the next most important thing in my game was explosions. Yeah, in the beginning I was over-engineering the explosions a bit. As you can see, I created a sprite sheet of different textures from the asset pack that I liked, and I tried to rearrange them in a way that it looks like a fiery explosion animation. And somehow I found out afterwards that it looks more like a Christmas ornate explosion than a real fiery explosion. So yeah, I had to go back again and make it more simpler, and in the end it worked out much better. I also added another layer to the explosion made up of emoji sprite. I just wanted to make it a bit more funnier and break up the explosion with some elements that are not so usual. Yeah, that's the result. I like it somehow. I'm not sure if I will keep it forever. I added another layer to the explosion, spikes that shoot outwards to give it some more forceful look. So to do that, I used the sprite and set it up so the particles animation frames don't match the texture. So the texture basically gets cut up into small spikes. Yeah, making those shoot outwards with a little bit of color. After tweaking around with the settings, it looked like this. And with all the elements enabled, it kind of looked like an explosion. I was really afraid of the explosion because making an explosion with this sprite sheet, let's put it like this, it was a challenge. I had the feeling that the explosion needed more glow, so I used a very simple shader to create a gradient that somehow fitted the overall colors of the explosion. And when set to blend add, the explosion looked much more like an actual explosion with some glow that pulls all the elements together. Quickly animated everything using an AnimationPlayer, and yeah, that's that. I very quickly created some landmines with those explosions using some sprites of the sprite pack, an area 2D and a trigger, and then it goes boom. At that point in the project, I wanted to start adding enemies. My first thought was just taking the player car and basically changing the controller to an NPC-controlled controller. So the car physics and everything stayed the same, but the controller is not controlled by the keyboard, but is controlled by NPC. So it tries to find the player, find the direction, and control the car accordingly. Yeah, that was quite a bit of challenge getting it up and running. But after some initial fails, it started to work, at least in a very simple way. After some tweaking with values, after some refactoring of this very simple steering code, it started to be fun to race around with the other guy that's exactly like you, just a little modulated. But it was fun seeing the other car chasing, trying to get it to run into landmines. I had the feeling I was on the right direction for the project. And when I started to add guns to the cars and make the enemy shoot at you when it has the right angle, I noticed that first I had to make a variation of the car, as you can see right now, the player car. And you can see that I accidentally recreated Tron in a very funny way.
Wasteland Tron.
But I also noticed the problem. While it was fun to race the other car, it was very boring that crashing the other car, having an impact, made no difference at all because it was kinematic bodies. So a collision would basically do nothing to each other, except if I coded. So I thought it would be way cooler to make the player car a rigid body, so it can react to physics, but the results were not so satisfying in the beginning. Yeah, I had to rewrite some code. At least I could keep all the complicated engine code. After having that done, I was still fighting with some bugs, as you can see. But yeah, when I had the basic AI car done and the guns done, so they shoot when they see you and they don't shoot when they're in front of each other, the game really started to become potentially fun. So yeah. After the cars, I wanted to add some more enemy variation. I wanted to have at least some kind of simple shooter enemy, like infantry enemies, a melee enemy, which is the scorpion, and the grenade guy. And I ended up in the end also adding a sniper, because when I had the basic system set up, it was very simple to just add a laser pointer and make a guy shoot after a certain delay. So yeah, making those was achieved by splitting up smaller regions of the sprite sheet, combining them, animating those single parts in AnimationPlayer, add some modulation, and create some very simple animations. By combining all those different animation layers, I could achieve interesting animations for these kind of assets, and I was very happy with the simple walk animation, idle animation, attack animation. It really looked organic. What also really helped there was to also animate the scale of the overall character. It may look really strange at the beginning when you do it, and it also looks strange in the video. If you play it fast enough, it makes it much more juicy and organic. I added that to all characters, especially on the attack animations that are very quick, and you can see how it really makes it much more interesting, much more organic. I used the same techniques on the animations for the soldiers, put everything into separate parts, and you can see in the hierarchy and the scene hierarchy it looks really wild, but in the end what works works, so I was fine with that. Yeah, and after fiddling around randomly with vector math, after some trials and errors, I got it working that it just charges the player, walks toward the player, and controlling that rigid body is almost similar to the car, so I apply impulses left and right to turn them, and yeah, just add some acceleration to speed them up. Yeah, and it looks really funny when they bunch up and push around the player car, because yeah, it's all physics based, so everything is a rigid body and has velocity, so yeah, it's really cool. I wanted to make damage in the game look much more persistent, so I added a little scene, a very simple script that creates random, more or less random blood splatters from the assets I found in the sprite sheet. And every time the thing is spawned, it just splatters those around randomly. Yeah, and that worked pretty well. I later found out that it was the culprit for some performance problems, but that was easily fixed. Yeah, so every time an enemy gets hit, I spawn those blood pools. They get modulated in a way that fits to the enemy. So red for human enemies and green for those scorpions. And I also added a detection for the impact speed of the player car, so I can run over those guys, and it started to become really fun and had this old school GTA 2 feeling that I was looking for. I also added a random modulation to many game objects, so it just looks more interesting seeing all those plants and all those enemies, and they always look a little bit different. So after having some enemies done, I started working on some basic maps to try out movement, to try out avoidance of enemies. And you can see here again, using the Smart Shape 2D is a really cool way of making quick elements for your maps. Here I had to combine different layers because I was limited to the asset pack. So using those, I was able to quickly create maps with more or less interesting patterns that limited movement of the player and the enemies. And yeah, it made it much more interesting, and creating those rocks was very simple as drawing a polygon. And you can also see that I added a very simple enemy tracking system on the edge of the screen. And at first I tried to solve the problem with math, but obviously I was too dumb. And so I just created basically a collision box around the car that fits to the size of the camera, casted a raycast to the position of the enemy, and that worked. But yeah, a bit cheap, but hey, whatever works. I wanted to create a very simple damage indication system. So I created a particle system that looked a bit like fire, and depending on the amount of damage that the player car or even the enemy cars have, I add those fire effects onto the cars. So the player can see on the first sight, oh, I'm burning really crazy, I should probably go a bit more passive about my gameplay. And yeah, I just stuck the fire effects onto the player car whenever you're damaged, so you can instantly see if you're damaged or not. So I started working on the player UI, which was also a bit of a challenge because of the limitation of the asset pack. I made some elements using Polygon 2Ds, That worked quite well. I also had an indicator for the amount of boost your car had left. To color that, I used a gradient and just interpolated the value of the current boost cell onto the color. So worked pretty nice. Yeah, and slowly I was starting to create maps. Everything was coming together slowly. I also added an objective marker. So every time you get a new objective, like kill them all or exit the map, you will get a message on your screen telling you what to do next. I had the feeling that really helped, giving the player some direction. All I had to do was basically finish maps. Like I said, I used a lot of the Smart Shape 2D to create the mountains, and like this I could really quickly create maps. And to add some variation to the map's visual look, I had a gradient on each map that manipulated the post-processing a bit, so I could apply an individual look to each map. And I also had some colors there that manipulated the shader colors, so I could quickly change the overall aesthetic of a map, and that made it very easy to make all the maps interesting. So yeah, at that point, basically all that was left to do is to put everything together, to create the main menu, make each level follow the next. Yeah, I tested a little bit and there are quite some bugs left, but overall it's a fun game and I'm really happy with the project, how it turned out. If you like, go to itch, check it out, have fun, and I'm looking forward to your feedback. So that's it for today. I really hope you liked the video. If you did, leave a like. If you didn't like the video, leave a dislike. Yeah, if you have questions or feedback, write it below in the comments. If you want to keep updated, make sure to hit the subscribe button. And if you like the game, you can check out the Steam page. I will put it below in the info box. And see you next time.